Let me start a little bit like this morning. I like meeting new people, right? And in the last couple of years, obviously, big transition. I have a lot of new people. And you find yourself at kind of hanging out with people, and you're trying to get to know each other. You're trying to figure out if you've got anything in common. You're trying to figure out if they're a weirdo. They're trying to figure out if you're a weirdo. You know, that sort of stuff. And that was just my interview process. And I've discovered this question. I love this question of asking people, and you're welcome to take this from you, right? A lot of kind of these icebreaker questions that people have, like, you know, what's your favorite movie and stuff like that, that just starts fights, right? Here's a great question to ask people when you meet them for the first time. What's the best movie you've never seen? All right? Because everybody has this one movie that they secretly feel a little bit of guilt about because, like, you know, I really should have seen that and it's a classic and all my very clever friends have watched this movie. If you ask people, you know, what's the best movie you've ever seen, like all men always just say Shawshank Redemption. Most of them don't actually understand it. We just know that's the proper answer. Also, you see, the thing is this, you never ask the question, what's the best album in the world? Right? You never ask that question because there is only one right answer. And the answer is the White Album by the Beatles. Right? And there are basically two thoughts on this. You either think this is the best album in the world ever, or you're wrong. It's as simple as that. You should own this album in at least 2 formats because that shows long-term commitment to this project. This album was amazing. In an era of lavish art, when you brought the LPs just because they came with cool artwork, the Beatles produced an album cover, this is a very old copy here, that literally just had their name embossed on the front of it. And at the center of this amazingly genius piece of album, we find a writing partnership. 2 young guys from England. Liverpool, as it is, called Paul McCartney and John Lennon. One articulate, polite, patient, a diplomat. The other loud, often rude, impatient, and an agitator. But together, they changed the face of Western music. Music today in the Western world is different because of these 2 guys. And I was just thinking about this. I was thinking about how many partnerships have actually changed the world. We live in a world that kind of likes the lone hero, but when you actually scratch around a little bit, you find there's often a couple of genius brains behind the scenes working at stuff. You mention the company Apple, for example, and immediately people think of Steve Jobs. But Apple began with 2 Steves, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, both of them editing some stuff there, but also showing us why there were eras of the past that haircuts weren't, you know. You know, when you look at kids today and you think, what is going on with hairstyles these days? I give you the 1970s. These 2 guys came together and changed the face of computing as we now know it. And this is common, this partnership of people coming together. William Proctor had James Gamble. Bill Hewlett had Dave Packard. Simon had Garfunkel. And the partnership that sits at the heart of most of our Saturday evenings, Ben had Jerry. So it may be no surprise then to learn that at the center of our story that we're telling this summer, we don't just find one person. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 2-3, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul. So Paul is still using his Hebrew name at this stage. As Saul moves out into Western Europe, he starts to find himself in a Greek-speaking world. In the Greek-speaking world, they don't have the letter to make the Hebrew sound for Shaul. So Paul starts to go by his Greek name, Paul. That's why this name changes. So Shaul becomes Paul. But Barnabas and Saul set them apart for the work to which I have called them. And so after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Barnabas and Paul were the Lennon and McCartney of the early church. Commissioned by the early church, they are the first missionary partnership that heads out into the world with this incredible message about the resurrected Jesus. They don't do it alone, they do it in partnership. And as you read your way through the story of Acts, what you find is Barnabas and Paul did some incredible work for Jesus as they moved their way into Western Europe. The Spirit guides them to Seleucia, Cyprus, and Salamis. In Paphos, they find themselves engaged in this discussion and argument with a false prophet. They find themselves teaching in the synagogues of Sidon, Antioch. And in Iconium, they find themselves threatened with stoning. And yet, despite all of these trials and tribulations, this team, Barnabas and Paul head into the world to proclaim the gospel. You may remember this quote from last week. I like it so much, I'll use it twice. Bishop Tom Wright said this: "Wherever St. Paul went, there was a riot. And wherever I go, they serve tea." In this day and age, we can move around the world quite comfortably and tell stories about Jesus. We can find ourselves in many places of the world. It's quite safe to tell that story. In fact, if you go there, you'll even find that there will be Christians there already. That's not true of the whole world, but it is true of lots of the world. But when Paul went with Barnabas, they were pronouncing this new proclamation of Jesus that people hadn't heard before, and it didn't always go down well. Because one of the things that Paul was doing was he was coming along and renouncing that it wasn't just here's a new God that you can add to your list of gods already, but he was offering you a chance to follow Jesus, who was the only God. And it involved a complete departure from your previous way of life. And in the midst of all this trials and tribulation, they find themselves, Barnabas and Paul, together changing the world. In Acts 15, it was Barnabas and Paul that successfully contended for the gospel to be available for Jews and non-Jews. These two men stood in front of the Jerusalem council and argued that it wasn't necessary for non-Jewish men to be circumcised in order that they might follow Jesus. So for the gentlemen in the room, Paul and Barnabas, your new heroes. If it wasn't for them, becoming a Christian for the men would be a significantly different thing than it is today. Praise be to God. The choir might be a bit fuller, but you know. This success of this incredible partnership moving their way throughout the Western world makes the next story that I want to tell you this morning a little more surprising. Two men pulled apart by the Holy Spirit, brought out apart from their setting into this new partnership to serve God, commissioned by the church, the first missionary partnership of Christianity. And then we find this story. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia. You read that story in Acts chapter 13 if you want. And he had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. The first great missionary partnership of Christianity dissolves in a fight over Barnabas' cousin. Barnabas wants to take him along on this journey. Paul says he bailed out on us once before. Once a bailer, always a bailer. We're not doing that again. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Anger, irritation, perhaps exasperation, stalemate. Perhaps you've had a sharp disagreement with somebody at some point in your life. You know what it's like to fall out, but not that kind of, awkward fallout, that slight discontent that you have because you don't think the Beatles is the best album in the world. Not that type of argument, but the type of argument that takes over your whole life, where you become exhausted with the argument. That seems to be what's going on here with Barnabas and Paul. These great heroes of the faith, unable to solve a problem like this. And it's a pretty shameful episode in Paul's life. And the fact that actually we find it in the Bible is quite interesting to us. Perhaps many people would expect that you wouldn't tell a story like this when you were telling the story of your hero. Luke sits down to write this story about Paul, and he keeps this slightly awkward story in there, an embarrassing story. It's not the story that presents Paul in the best of lights. It doesn't present early Christianity in the best of lights, because here they are arguing about whether to take this particular guy with them on this journey. I sometimes wonder how Paul felt about this when he looked back in his life. Paul writes all these letters about community harmony. He writes these letters to the church. He's telling them to get on with one another, to put their disagreements beyond sort of just the thing that's breaking them down and move into harmony. And as Paul's writing these letters, I wonder how often he reflected on this particular moment of his life when he couldn't find harmony with his missionary partner. And they end up in this very visible conflict. I find myself at another level fascinated by a consistency in Scripture. And the consistency is this, that the Bible doesn't seem to ever want to cover up the history of its core characters. When you read Bible stories, the heroes of the story are often presented to you with their failings relatively evident. We see both sides of their characters. Paul, this incredibly passionate, driven man, wants to spread the gospel around the world, but that passion and drivenness and single-mindedness makes his relationships quite difficult for him in this particular story. As I was working on this teaching this week, I found it coincided with me watching the news stories change in a way that I would rather they didn't, where Willow Creek Church in Chicago was hitting mainstream news cycles, but for all the wrong reasons. Wherein it seems that for many years, failings of this very high-profile church leader have been covered up by the church board and eldership to try and maintain the success that the church had going on. But the whole time it was a facade over some very ungodly things that were happening apparently behind the scenes. And it struck me as I watched this make mainstream news cycles, not just Christian news pages, but headline pages. I was on a BBC worldwide website, and there it was on the homepage. And it struck me as I watched this cover-up story of a church, and then I'm reading this story of Luke tell us about Paul and Barnabas with no sense of cover-up. If you've been reading Acts throughout the last few weeks, you'll notice Paul is Luke's hero. Paul is just this incredible character. The way Luke tells the story of Paul, you're in no doubt that Luke thinks Paul is an amazing servant of Jesus, but still he tells you this ugly story. And I love that the Bible is transparent on its heroes. They have their failings, and they don't always even live up to their own standards. Paul in Romans 12, verse 18, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. But Paul found his own possibilities stretched in this conversation with Barnabas. And we have a lot of difficulty with conflict. I don't know about you, I don't really like conflict. I don't like being in arguments. I don't like disagreements. I really don't like disharmony. I find it tiring. I find it exhausting. I find it hard work. Because it's so easy just to settle on a way, just to live with it. Let's not ruffle any feathers. Let's not change anything around. Let's just go with the way things are so that we don't have to have a fight. My suspicion is that most normal people, that's true. Right? Occasionally you do meet somebody who loves a good fight. Right? I don't know what it is about them. They just love to have a good fight. But most of us, we don't like fighting. We don't like getting involved in an argument. We don't like being in a place of disharmony. And that's specifically true, I think, in church life. That it becomes very complex sometimes to navigate the different personalities amongst all the diversity of us in one particular community. I sometimes wonder if our difficulty with conflict is also that we've kind of tended in Christian history to categorize conflict as sin. It's like it's a bad thing to be in conflict. And I want to say this morning. As much as I find conflict difficult, let's just be clear. Conflict isn't sin. Conflict may contain sin. The way that we behave within conflict might actually be ungodly. But actually falling out with one another, having disagreements, seeing things differently is what it is to be in a diverse community. In their book on church conflict, Cosgrove and Hadfield say this: the best way to manage conflict is to treat it as something normal and to bring it out into the open where it can be handled fairly and constructively. Two men, Paul and Barnabas, they fall out over something. It seems that Luke's wanting us to know that's kind of ordinary. That's the sort of thing that happens in day-to-day life without it being a particularly special day. Perhaps you've noticed this. And the idea of conflict being normal, for some of us, the idea of conflict being normal is enough to keep us in bed for the whole day, right? Just like, well, if I'm going to have conflict today, I'm staying in bed. Because many people that I've talked to tell me that when they know that they've got a conflict, they've got a different conversation coming up at work. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. It kind of becomes hard to think about anything else. You're trying to do things, but it's taking over. You're replaying the story in your head. Oh, I'm going to say this, and I wonder what they might say. Well, if they say this, I'll say that. And if I say that, they'll say this. And we find ourselves wrapped up in this all-encompassing, all-consuming conflict. We also seem to know this is a reality in the contemporary world. How many of you find that people are in agreement with you all the time? How many of you have noticed that actually it seems that that's not the case? In fact, people seem to be in disagreement with you a lot of the time. You may be the smartest person in the room. You may be the most experienced person in the room. You may know more about the particular subject in question than anybody else. You may even be paid to be the boss. And maybe you've noticed that that doesn't seem to make any difference when it comes to disagreements. You might be in charge. It might be your decision. Your head may be on the line if it doesn't actually work out. But guess what? Everybody lines up to tell you that their opinion is different from yours. Or is that just me? You remember when you were a kid and you used to have this dream and you were a kid, like we were British, so like our dream was, when I'm older, I'd love to be the king because then everybody would do what I said. And then you look at the people who are in charge of our countries now and realize, yeah, that's a surefire way to ensure that nobody agrees with anything you say, right? But I want to talk a little bit about conflict this morning because it seems that it's something that happens to all of us. It's something that's ever present in church life, in business life, in work life, in family life, and it's even present in the life of Paul and Barnabas as they try and spread the gospel of Jesus. Many conflicts center around something when we get involved in them that Fisher and Urey, who are two consultants with Harvard on how we do good negotiation, they call this thing, they talk about conflict that generally happens in what they call positional bargaining. And if you think about conflicts you've had, when I think about conflicts I've had, this is invariably what I do. Positional bargaining is basically where each side in a conflict takes a position and argues for it. And essentially, we hold our ground as best as we can by giving in as little as we can until somewhere along the line we find either a compromise or an impasse. If you're a really good negotiator at positional bargaining, you move the least. It's like a big game of tug of war. You stand on your side with your rope, they stand on their side with their rope, and you both pull. And hopefully at some point, when the final conflict is over, everything's nearer your side than it is their side. You go home happy, they don't go home so happy, but hey, it's a compromise. No one's happy, right? He who moves least wins. And this can be really helpful as a way of arguing, and this is probably why we naturally tend to go towards this. By setting out your position, it's quite helpful because the people you're in conflict with, the people you're having difficulty with, are often very clear what you want. I don't know if you've noticed that, but when you lay out your position, you're basically intending that everybody hears what you're about. This is my position and I'm holding it. This is what I want. It also helps you because you're very clear on what it is that you want. You know how to hold your corner and defend what it is that you're trying to do. However, this way of doing conflict, and we kind of see Paul and Barnabas doing this a little bit. I want to take John Mark. I don't want to take John Mark. Well, I do. Well, I don't. Well, I do. Well, I don't. And eventually most arguments descend into us just restating our positions. Have you noticed that? And if I keep restating my position with a slight increase in decibel, this will improve my argument. Because there's nothing improves an argument better than saying the same thing louder. And then at a certain point, somebody moves the argument into kind of warp speed by saying the most inflammatory words in all arguments. Stop shouting. To which the only reply is, I'm not shouting. Some of you have had these arguments. Positional bargaining has a lot of weaknesses to it. It doesn't guarantee that we're going to reach an agreement. If we just keep restating our position, well, we may never move to be in the same sort of space. You may have noticed that when you hold your position hard and the other person holds their position hard, actually outside of that argument, our relationships start to be affected. Have you noticed that when you're in argument with someone, the argument takes over your whole lives? Have you ever tried to have a really, really good positional argument with someone and then go for a coffee with them afterwards and just be friends? We seem to struggle as humans to have an argument about a difference of opinion and then put it down and carry on with life as normal. Position holding essentially takes over everything and affects our view of that person in totality, not just this particular argument. Invariably, what happens if you hold your position and you win, your relationship is affected going forward. How many times have you heard people say, well, he beat me in the argument, he's such a great guy? I really disagree with him, but I just love hanging out. And of course, what happens is a lot of the time our conflicts in our day-to-day life actually involve more than one person. So when you take a game of tug of war and add 2 or 3 extra ropes in there, how on earth are we ever going to find a solution? I wonder if sometimes our problem also comes in all of this way of doing conflict, that we have a tendency to focus on people and not problems. Have you ever noticed that? We get into the conflict and we find it hard to separate the conflict from the person. We find it hard to separate out what's actually at stake in the argument and the person itself. We can't separate personalities. If you ever hear yourself talking about a conflict at work, for example, or in your street, and you use words like, well, that guy, or, well, the problem with her is, you realize that you're no longer talking about the nature of the conflict itself. You're now actually talking about the person. Have you noticed how quickly you do that with others? Have you ever noticed someone do it to you? That in the midst of an argument, you start realizing, I'm not sure if this argument is any longer about the subject. It may be about me. Because personalities are so deeply rooted into who we are that we struggle to separate them. If you ask many fans of the Beatles why the Beatles broke up, why did this incredible partnership of Lennon and McCartney end? Most people will give you one word answer: Yoko. This is fascinating because Paul McCartney is actually on record several times saying Yoko didn't break up the Beatles. We were already breaking up. We were already falling apart, he says. And Yoko came along and just helped John find what it was that he was going to do next. And yet still, this poor lady, well, she's not that poor. This rich lady for whom we might feel sad gets blamed for breaking up one of the biggest bands in history. We like blaming people. We like putting the blame on personalities. And most of our conflicts struggle, and our ability to restore ourselves after conflict, our ability to put things back together becomes so much more difficult because much of the time, when we're involved in conflict, it's not the problem we end up arguing about, it's the person. In Acts chapter 15, this story that we read just a few minutes ago, it's easy to read this story and immediately decide who's to blame for breaking up this band. Paul and Barnabas were doing great, and then John Mark came along. And all of a sudden, he takes the blame. And oftentimes you'll find this in the commentaries, actually. You'll find this amongst really good scholars. You'll find them saying, yep, Paul and Barnabas, the reason they broke up was because of a disagreement over John Mark. And Mark takes a lot of the blame for this, and I think a little unfairly. Because actually the truth is, as we're saying in our conversation, there's probably more going on here. And if we spend a little time looking at Paul and even looking at how this story is presented, we find certain aspects that we can make sense of to say, it's probably not Mark's fault. He's just easy to blame. Pretty much every difficult conversation that you have in your life will actually share a few very similar structural similarities. And I want to talk about them just now. If you're going to do a tough conversation, it's worth noting that these 3 things are often going on in any conflict or difficult conversation. First is a question of what actually happened. Second, there's a question of how do you feel about this? How do I feel about this argument that I'm presently in? And thirdly, who am I? These 3 questions are worth remembering when we go into any sort of difficult conversation. When you're in the midst of the conflict, ask yourself this question: how am I responding to these 3 questions? And how is the person that I'm talking to responding to these 3 questions? What happened? Let's begin there. You're in a fight. The conversation's going on. One person stating their position, another person stating their position. Paul says, hey, Barnabas, I'm not caring what you're thinking. John Mark abandoned us. This is a tough journey that we're going on. We have to head across the Mediterranean world. It's dangerous. We don't need to rely on someone that's going to bail out on us when the going gets tough. Barnabas, well, I thought we were Christians, Paul. Like, it's all about second chances. It's all about grace. It's about us learning that we make mistakes. Like, come on, if you read the story a little further back, Barnabas was the only Christian brave enough to go and actually disciple Paul. Right? So Barnabas has been with Paul from the very beginning. I wonder if at this point in the chart, I'm reconstructing the argument here. We don't have text for this, okay? But maybe Barnabas goes, hey, Paul, wait a minute. Like, what if I'd had that attitude with you? Like, you were killing Christians. All that Mark did was kind of left us behind. Like, seriously, give the guy a break. Like, do to others as you would have them do to you. Somebody famous said that. Maybe you should think about this. And the problem that happens in a lot of our conversations that are over conflict situations is that all of us on all sides of the debate assume that we're telling the truth. My version of the story is the right version of the story. Have you noticed that? I never go into an argument with the assumption that actually my story's wrong, but I'm just going to argue it anyway. It's because I think I'm right that makes me hold my ground. The difficulty in the Paul and Barnabas situation is they're both right. Mark did abandon them. The gospel is about grace. So how do we work that out? Perhaps sometimes a better question than are you right or not is what's important. What's the most important thing in the conversation? You might both be right. The person you're arguing with is probably making a good point. They probably have a perspective on things that's valid because they're just looking at it differently from you. But what's important? Have you also noticed that when we talk about what happened, we know our truth and we hold our truth as the only truth and we project intentions onto the other? Have you ever found yourself in a conflict situation telling other people what's going on in the person you're arguing with's head? Well, the problem with them is, you see, what they're trying to do is this. How do you know what they're trying to do? Are you a mind reader all of a sudden? But I do this all the time. I reconstruct people's intentions, and then I respond to them based on what I think they're thinking. Have you ever done that? It's not the words that they're saying, it's your mind-reading ability that's actually getting to the heart of the situation. Like, I see your mouth moving, but who cares about your mouth? Because I'm like there, we're like this, and I am reading your intentions. And therefore, I apply all these unfounded assumptions onto this person. Have you also noticed how quickly, when we could talk about what happened, we blame? We drop to blame. Like, it's funny when you watch children argue how quickly they blame in an argument. What's even funnier is we say it's funny that children do that, but we do exactly the same in our own situations. We get into conflict, and very, very quickly, we have, this is my truth. I know what you're thinking, and it's definitely your fault. For Paul and Barnabas, it seemed obvious to Paul that Mark was the problem. Barnabas seemed to think that Mark was someone who had potential and they could go somewhere with him. And then we who read the story so often put the blame on Mark. But maybe a better question than what happened for them was to ask what's important in this? What is it that we're trying to do? Then another question, how do I feel? Your emotional footprint in a conflict matters. Now, every argument you have doesn't need to turn into a crying and sharing session. That's not what I'm suggesting right now. But let's be honest, we're not robots. Have you noticed how your emotional state can affect how you get involved in conflict? So how do we learn to discuss our feelings? How do you feel about something? One of the most profound questions that you can ask yourself in a conflict is, how do I feel? The second thing is to ask the other person, how do you feel? I've been in arguments sometimes where simply, we were to have stopped and asked about our feelings. I don't feel that you're listening to me. I don't feel that you think I'm a good person. I don't feel that you understand what it is that I'm trying to say. How those little statements like that would have changed the whole discussion. Barnabas might have said to Paul, Paul, I don't feel that you're giving Mark the credit that he needs. Paul, I don't think that you're understanding the difficult situation that I'm in, Barnabas might have said. He's my cousin. Families are awkward. I can't just turn around to the family and go, no, we're cutting him loose because my buddy doesn't like him. How do I feel? Remember that you have a complex range of emotions. You may have noticed this. But also remember that the people that you're talking to, the people that you're in conflict with, have complex emotions too. For Paul, betrayal was hard to get over. Do you know there's no recorded situation in history, in Jewish writings, of a rabbi having a student leave them and then join them again? This was unfounded territory for Paul. Mark left us. We were teaching him and he left us. So that's the end. Mark has shown Paul that he doesn't want to face difficulty. And for Paul, the question seems to be, should the importance of the work of Jesus that we're doing be placed at the mercy of this inconsistent person? For Barnabas, however, not only was it his cousin, he really does seem to want to. If you follow the little bits of Barnabas' story we have in Acts, Barnabas wants to go the extra mile with people. He was willing to go and disciple Paul, so he wants to take a chance on Mark. Perhaps the most important question for us to ask in conflict is, who am I? What's going on with your identity? How we see ourselves is an inner dialogue that often turns its way around in any conflict. See, conflict often scratches at the issues of our own identity, our own insecurities, our own issues with ourselves, our own perspectives on who we are. You can be in an argument. Maybe you've noticed this in your life. If you're able to think through what's going on internally while also the argument's going on externally, have you noticed how often that an argument will scratch at some of the issues that are core to your identity? Have you ever found yourself in an argument and come away from it thinking, am I actually competent? Like, can I actually do this job? Because that argument left me thinking that maybe I couldn't. Or maybe you've had arguments sometimes and you come away thinking, am I a good person? Because something's gone so wrong with the conflict that you're actually beginning to ask very deep questions about who you are. Am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of kindness and love? And for Paul and Barnabas, I think this question of who am I helps us understand the conflict that they find themselves in. It wasn't John Mark that they were actually arguing about. He was just the location of this particular fight. Because they're two very different people with two very different missions and calls in their life. For Paul, his call was to preach the gospel, to travel, to encourage churches, to plant churches in new areas. And John Mark was a threat to this. Perhaps Paul has forgotten his own story, but his mind seems to be, we've got to go and do what Jesus has called us to do. The Holy Spirit brought us together so that we would go and do this particular job, and that's a threat to it. And when his identity is so wrapped up, read all of Paul's letters, and his opening line is Paul, an apostle, someone sent by God to the churches. And his sense of who he is doesn't fit with the risk of taking this young guy, Mark, and investing in him and dealing with these challenges and unpacking that potential. Barnabas' name literally means son of encouragement. Like, there's a guy to have on your team. You know, if you had a guy that worked in your office and his name was son of encouragement, right? Like when you're having a down day, you're going to his office, right? You know, assuming he lives up to his name, right? Son of encouragement. He was literally, that was what he did. That was his name. Barnabas, our first encounter with him, is he sold family land to help finance the church. He's given and sacrificed it of his own investment future so that the church can continue. He's brave enough to disciple Paul. And now Paul is basically rubbing up against Barnabas' sense of identity. We've got to encourage this Mark. We've got to grow him. He's got potential. Developing this young leader seems to be the type of thing that Barnabas does. He invests his own money into growing leaders in the church. He invests his own life into the risk of discipling Paul. So he's going to stand up, because developing John Mark and giving him a second chance is part of who he is. And I read this story, I find myself a little sad at this incredible partnership breaking down. But I also want to console myself with this thought. Sometimes great bands break up. They were both right, and that's why this is a difficult story. But when those who are engaged in conflict reach the point where their voices are hoarse from yelling, their brains are mushy from all the analytical gymnastics that you find yourself doing when you're trying to win a fight, they can't dialogue anymore. Paul and Barnabas do something profound. They agree to disagree. Not in the way that we often do that nowadays, which is what that often means in contemporary life is we're both just still angry, but we'll just take a short break. Paul and Barnabas decide that the mission of God is central, that Barnabas has to live out what God has called him to do, And Paul has to live out what God has called him to do. And so they go their separate ways. The fascinating thing is that more people are then reached for the gospel. The conflict doesn't stop God's work because they don't stay and fight. They decide to carry on with their missions. And as you follow the story, you realize that Paul's intention was to go and strengthen churches. But now with Silas, they actually do lots of evangelistic work. As you follow the story on from Acts 15 onwards, Silas and Paul spread the gospel into all sorts of different places that we may not have gotten a chance to see them doing that in. Barnabas, we don't follow his story so closely because Luke is following Paul at this point. But Barnabas also goes off to do his work for the gospel. See, because it seems to be that for me, rarely in conflict between Christians does Jesus win. We end up fighting. We end up in the press for the wrong reasons. Churches fall apart, churches divide, leadership falls out. This sort of story has often turned its way through Christian history. And the one thing that I love about the story of Paul and Barnabas is they seem to keep the mission of God central. They don't lose people, they gain people. Maybe it would have been better if they stayed together. Maybe that would have been less conflict. Maybe we would like that. But God was still working through the situation. And so often Christians make the news for the wrong reasons. Perhaps you've noticed that. Christians on Twitter aren't any better than people who are not Christians on Twitter. Have you noticed that? We're not often better in the workplace. And the church can have conflicts that are more brutal than even the regular world. But Paul and Barnabas kept the gospel central. Perhaps one of the roles of the church is to model a way of conflict that keeps Jesus at the center. Perhaps one of our roles as a prophetic witness to the world is to show that it's not that we agree on everything, but when we do disagree, we do it in a way that the church continues to grow. The incredible grace of Jesus is still shared. The wonderful, life-changing encounter with the gospel still happens. Because when we do conflict, we do it like Jesus. I want to mention one more thing. So what happens to John Mark, the Yoko Ono of the New Testament? We follow the story of Acts. It tells us more about Paul. We don't actually really know too much about what happens with Barnabas. But in Colossians chapter 4 and Philemon, verse 24, when Paul's writing both those letters, he just drops a little comment about someone who happens to be working with him, whose name is John Mark, and he calls him a fellow worker. Something has happened in between Paul and Barnabas' fight and Paul writing Philemon and Colossians. And now John Mark and Paul are working together again. In 2 Timothy 4 verse 11, Paul describes Mark as helpful to him in ministry. I wonder how many conflicts would be solved if we were a little quicker to admit that it's ever so possible we might be wrong. And this great apostle, this man that pushed the gospel throughout Western Europe, that it shaped so much of the contemporary world as we know it today, finds himself secretly, maybe implicitly perhaps, admitting that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong about John Mark. John Mark did have potential. He did have gift. And I love this Bible story that tells us that Paul was possibly a little tiny bit wrong. Fascinatingly, if you're into this sort of thing, John Mark, so holds Christian tradition, is the same Mark that wrote the second gospel. When Paul's wrong, he does it big style. Let's stand for a blessing. May you thank God today that the Bible shows us the mistakes and not just the miracles. May you realize that you yourself can be released from any guilt about conflict, but may you learn to fight in such a way that at very least Jesus wins, even if you can't. We are all complex. We are all equally valuable to God. We have thoughts, emotions, and pasts that don't always work well for us in times of conflict. But may we learn how to do difficult conversations well so that the gospel may continue. And may God's grace and peace be upon you.